You're listening to The Secrets of Star Trek, where we discuss the hidden layers and deeper meanings found in all the Star Trek TV series, movies, and more. And today we're discussing the latest episode of Star Trek Picard, 17 Seconds. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today on the panel are Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
And Father Cory Sticha. Hey, Father Cory.
How's it going?
Folks, be sure to share the podcast with your friends. Help us grow this community of Star Trek fans and reach more listeners. That's the number one way we get more listeners, is by people recommending us. I want you to stick around. Make sure you stick around for the end of this podcast. We have a lot of really awesome feedback from you, the listeners and viewers, so I want to make sure you get to hear that. Another show on the StarQuest Network you're sure to enjoy is a bunch of Star Trek fans called the Catholics of Oz. You can find them wherever fine podcasts are found, or at sqpn.com/Oz or OZ. So before we get to talking about 17 Seconds, I want to talk
Are you sure, Dom, it's not the Catholics of Ounce?
No, Oz as in like Australia.
Okay.
So there's a bit of news this week that came out, which is that it was announced that Star Trek Discovery will be coming to an end after season 5, which will air in 2024. I think we're all less than enthusiastic fans of Discovery. It has its high points and its low points.
Mostly low.
More low than high, I think. So I wanted to sort of react to that and discuss what we think it means. What does it maybe mean for future Star Trek, given that Discovery was the first of the, TV series to return after Enterprise. So what do y'all think?
Well, so part of the decision may be ratings based, which may be, reflected in the poor quality of the show, which is just woke emotional therapy and with, not that great plotting. At least it was the last time I saw it. But a substantial chunk of the reason, and certainly how the studio is framing it, is a financial decision. Shows increase in their cost with each season because the Screen Actors Guild and other Hollywood unions have mandated pay raises each season. And so the costs go up for that reason. Also, thanks to the government printing all this lovely new money, we've had significant inflation. And that is, we haven't had in decades. So the costs have definitely gone up, and Discovery, as the longest running show of New Trek, is the most expensive. And so if you're gonna, if you're not getting the financial returns that you want on the show, it makes it the easy one to cancel. And so that's fine. They can use whatever justification they want. I'm just glad it didn't go 7 seasons, because 7 seasons, even with modern short seasons, would be considered a success. And I'm delighted that they didn't make it. I wanted to see this series fail, and it has failed. And so I'm happy for that reason. And hopefully, even though I'm certain they won't acknowledge it publicly, some of the lessons they've learned will stick. And because the other New Trek series have not been as bad. Lower Decks is not as bad. Prodigy is not as bad. Strange New Worlds is not as bad. Picard is not as bad. And so hopefully those lessons will stick, and future Trek going forward will be even more enjoyable.
What do you think, Father Cory, about this news?
They like they said in the article that I saw, was that it's, money issues. Of course, we'll never know if it's a ratings thing for real, because that's one thing with these streaming services, is they can hide the ratings so much easier than they could when you had, Nielsen ratings for all the different shows. And, these shows had so many viewers at the time it broadcast. That's the other part of it,
Right.
And I wonder too, if with these streaming services, they can see much more clearly who's watching the reruns, who's going back and streaming, season 1 2 years after it first released.
Right.
And I bet this is just my impression, other than the people who they like, the USS Emotional Discovery, people aren't picking it up. And especially when you do have Picard, which is an improvement. You have Prodigy and Lower Decks, which are dramatic improvements over Discovery. You have Strange New Worlds, which breakout hit. I mean, that's one thing they're trumpeting to the skies. Strange New Worlds, it's the best release we've had on Paramount Plus yet.
Right.
So, and that says a lot.
It does.
So, I think they recognize that while Discovery is to be credited for bringing back television Star Trek, we're going to be glad to see the USS Discovery go off into the sunset or into the sun.
Yes. Yeah. I heard it said that, I know, and I don't see a reference to it, so I don't know how true this is, but Alex Kurtzman, who's running Star Trek right now for Paramount, saying that they're limiting the number of series that they have going at any one time, which just makes sense. You don't want to have, it's to overstretch yourself, and that they can't start anything new until old ones end. So maybe this means that now that Discovery is ending, we're going to finally get that long rumored Section 31 series that they talked about long ago, that at one point Michelle Yeoh was going to be in, and maybe Alexander Siddig, Dr. Bashir, might be in. That would be really nice. I'd love to see that. Although some people are now talking about, and I don't know if this is just fan theories or if there's really something to it, a Worf Rothy series.
That's just fan theories, but it could happen. The cast has indicated their openness to, the next gen cast has indicated their openness to doing more. There are also reports, and again, I don't know how solid these are, of a Starfleet Academy series set in the 31st century or 32nd century, which would involve the, later Discovery time period and might involve characters like Tilly.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's all we need is, Beverly Hills 90210 set in Star Trek.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be done okay. I mean, that's the thing
it could be.
Yeah.
It could be.
I've never made it bones about Tilly is one of my favorite characters from Discovery. I always enjoyed Tilly. So it could be okay. I kind of don't like the 31st century setting anyway. So I'm kind of wish they'd just come back to the 25th century or the 24th, or was it the 23rd? I forget what Strange New Worlds is, and do something in those. I kind of would like them to stick to the 25th century and just kind of go from there. But the idea is Star Trek is successful overall, so let's keep doing good Star Trek.
I would like to see the 22nd century because they had the opportunity with Enterprise and failed to realize what they needed to do with it, which was tell us the story of the Romulan War and the founding of the Federation.
Yep. So it was too late. They finally we're starting to get around to it, and oh, by the way, you're canceled.
Yeah.
Right. They did the temporal time war thing, and that was a whole distraction. Yeah, I agree. I would like that. That's the time period I would like to see if they're going to do some prequel stuff. It would be fun. All right, so that's the news. Let's talk about the episode we just watched. And Jimmy, could you give us a recap?
This week on the Rafi Musiker Show, Rafi learns that her handler Worf is not technically Starfleet, but his interests align with theirs. Together, they track down a human who broke into the Daystrom Institute to steal the portal weapon, only they realize that this was just a distraction to distract from stealing something even more valuable. They also realize that the human isn't a human, but a changeling, and a member of a breakaway terrorist faction of changelings bent on destroying the Federation. Meanwhile, on the Captain Picard show, the Titan is playing hide-and-seek in the nebula with the Shrike. Picard confronts Beverly about why she never told him he had a son, and he's not satisfied with her explanation. Captain Shaw is injured when the Shrike attacks, and he turns command over to Riker. Picard keeps telling Riker to attack the Shrike, but Riker keeps refusing to do so in favor of running. Jack Crusher realizes that the Shrike is tracking them through the nebula, and he and Seven figure out that they have a gas leak due to sabotage. Jack runs into the saboteur, who is also a changeling, and Jack gets poisoned by the gas and has a vision from the nebula, which is actually alive, and it tells Jack to connect the branches, whatever that means. The changeling sets off a bomb, which damages the warp engines and prevents them from running. Desperate, Riker tries Picard's plan of attack, but the Shrike uses a portal weapon to strike them with their own photon torpedoes, disabling the ship. As they're falling into a gravity well in the nebula, Riker tells Picard to get off the bridge because he's just killed them all. The end.
So let's go around and talk about what we thought of this episode. Father Cory, what'd you think of this episode?
One thing we talked about last time was the title, 17 seconds. And of course, was this going to be a time loop episode? Was this going to, I thought
it wasn't.
I'm glad it wasn't.
Yeah.
I thought it was going to be, every 17 seconds, or that the Shrike was 17 seconds behind them, and it kind of was. I mean, that it wasn't specifically 17 seconds, but that idea of the 17 seconds from the bridge to the sick bay was kind of an interesting
by turbo lift.
Yeah, by turbo lift. But
yes,
that was an interesting way to play on it. But I liked the episode. I thought it was a very interesting episode. I liked the idea that using the portal gun to warp the photon torpedoes back at them. Although I saw a comment online on our Discord, I think, of, don't they have, friend or foe on their
they should
photon torpedoes?
They should. How about you, Jimmy? What'd you think of this episode?
I enjoyed it. I liked seeing the changelings be back in this. Mm-hmm. We even got a reference to Odo, not by name, but when Worf says he was informed of this changeling breakaway faction by a man of honor within the collective. So that's Odo. Yep. And I liked the confrontation between Beverly and Captain Picard, where they're both sharing their perspectives, and I'm sure we'll talk about that more later, but I liked that confrontation. I also liked the creative use of the portal gun, where the Shrike both kept the Titan from escaping from the nebula by just warping it right back into the nebula, and also the use to deflect the photon torpedo attack onto the Titan itself. That was nice creative thinking. We haven't seen that kind of thing done before on Star Trek. So I enjoyed that, and I thought it was a good episode overall. It didn't have major flaws to my mind.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I enjoyed this one. It was good. I'm glad it wasn't a time loop. I'm glad they did something a little different. I feel like the portal gun is, while it's not original to at all, I mean the game portal, the video game portal, it's pretty original in Star Trek, and I like that. And I like the themes of fatherhood that we're approaching in this episode, in this series, and I liked Picard and Riker kind of talking about being fathers, which was fun. We'll talk more about that as we go. And I too really liked that the acting in the scene between Picard and Crusher. I think Gates, McFadden, and Patrick Stewart did a great job of the subtleties in their performance, which was nice. I'm not sure. I want to talk more about Picard Riker on the bridge and that interaction. It seemed off.
It was a little weaker. Yeah, that was weaker.
But in general, like you both said, I think generally a pretty good episode. So I'm happy with it. So let's dig in. One of the first things that happens is Beverly tells Jack, in the midst of the battle, they're going to need us. And I was curious what you thought she meant by the Titan crew are going to need us. Was it simply we're both doctors, and so they're going to need us to be doctors? Okay.
That's how I took it. We should back up, though, to the opening flashback, which seems to be a thing now. They may open every episode with a flashback. This time we flash back to, and they don't say how many years ago it is, but
before
Riker's son has just been born, and Picard and Riker are having drinks in a bar. And Riker describes the birth of his son. He was on the bridge of the Titan when Deanna was in labor, and it was a rough labor, and it looked like they were going to lose the baby. Why that would be in the 24th century, I have no idea. Just beam the baby out. But it was a rough labor, and so they called him to sick bay, thinking the baby was going to die, and he took the turbo lift, and it took 17 seconds. So that gives us the title. And then his son survived, and he talked about what a meaningful experience it was to see his son and hold his son, and how that is transformative when you are a father for the first time. And Picard, even though he was happy for Riker, has not had that experience. And so now, during this episode, there's a part where Jack Crusher, who is not at all friendly to his father, and we're told Bev gave him the opportunity to go meet his father once he was old enough, and he refused. So, Picard feels snubbed by his own son. But then Jack Crusher gets injured, and he's in sick bay, and he may not live. And Picard is the one who has to go to sick bay, and we have his 17-second moment of going in a turbo lift to sick bay to see what you think is your dying son. And then he gets to see Jack live. And so we have a recapitulation of Riker's experience only for Picard now.
So going back to the bar scene, both Stewart and Frakes are de-aged electronically. What'd you think of the de-aging, by the way? Did it work for you? Was it Uncanny Valley?
I thought it was a little more subtle than some.
Yeah. I think they're getting better at it. Yeah.
Also, the lighting is low.
Yeah.
And it was in 10 forward, it was the new 10 forward, the 10 forward in
the bar. Yeah.
The bar,
Yeah.
But
in LA.
In LA, yeah. But it was, I thought it was much more subtle. It was there. It was noticeable that they were younger appearance. Although Picard less so than Riker. I think he still looked older.
Although Patrick Stewart is almost ageless. I mean, he hasn't changed that much in appearance. But yeah.
To tell you, I've seen people criticize, or I saw someone online criticizing the de-aging as like this was a major down for the episode, and I'm going, dude, I didn't even notice they were de-aged. That's not that. I mean, this was low lighting conditions. It wasn't major de-aging. I didn't notice it. Frankly, I don't know why they bothered. Because it's only a few years. I have suspension of disbelief. This is not them pretending to be 17 years old. Yeah. This is, 10 years ago, and I don't think, or something like that. And I don't think you need to, de-age people for 10 years. Just change their makeup a little bit.
That's what I thought it was. I thought it was more makeup work than it was actual de-aging technology.
Right. I mean, give Frakes, take the gray out of his hair, and you're pretty much there. So I thought it was interesting as Riker is telling his story, the 17 seconds, the longest turbo lift ride of my life. And he says, the line is, I thought I would lose my unborn son. And I gotta be one of those pro-life people, like, yes, he acknowledges that humanity of his son in that moment, and
there has been a change in the culture, including television. I mean, back in the 1970s, the sitcom Maude, which was a spinoff of All in the Family, had an episode where Maude gets an abortion. And I remember in the 80s and 90s, there was lots of hesitancy on television about, do we say unborn child or not? And now it's just accepted. There has been a positive change in the culture in that regard, even such that even liberal, evil Hollywood is going with the flow and talking about unborn children as children.
And he says in that moment, is when he became a father. And I kind of...
Well, no, you became a father 9 months earlier.
Yeah. But I think there's a psychological moment.
Yeah.
And I've talked to my wife about this, like, because when a woman's pregnant, she has the feeling, she knows it, she feels it. For a guy, we're kind of a little bit removed. We see, the belly getting bigger, and you could feel sometimes the baby moving. But there's a psychological switch that flips at the moment where you're confronted with, okay, this is this is really real. This is it. I'm in, like this is, and this, for me, I remember it was in the operating room. My wife had a cesarean, and seeing the baby lifted up for the first time and seeing the baby there is that moment where your mind switches and you become the protector, the provider, that sense. And so I can really understand, biologically he was father 9 months ago, but there's a moral and emotional moment.
Birth is an important moment because we get to see the child for the first time. I mean, today we can kind of see it with ultrasound, but it's when we see it with our own eyes that makes a big difference for us because we're visual creatures. And if we were dogs, it might be more when you can smell the child, which dogs might be able to do through the womb. They may smell those puppies in there.
I think so.
But the other thing is it's when life changes as a practical thing, because up to now you have this hidden growth going on, but when the child emerges, all of a sudden you can hear it crying. And you couldn't before. And now you've got to feed it and change it and, do all kinds of things and protect it and move it around because it's not just protected in the mother anymore. So birth is the moment when there are the most practical changes in addition to visible changes. So, birth is a big moment. Yep.
I did like Troy's reaction when she finds out that she calls Riker at the bar. I'm here changing diapers and feeding this child who won't sleep. You get back here, bring the whiskey.
That was nice.
Was good.
Oh, by the way, I was going to mention the thing about babies crying. That's an inbuilt reflex. Oh, yeah. And it's a sign of just how alpha we are as a species. Because, you look at like deer, for example, deer are a creature whose survival strategy is running away from things. And so deer infants make like no noise. They are silent by nature. They have evolved to be quiet. Whereas human infants scream their heads off, even though they are vastly more dependent than and incapable of surviving on their own than the creatures of other species. A baby deer can run away within 5 minutes of being born, but human babies are totally dependent on their parents for survival, and yet they are safe enough because of their parents that they have evolved to scream their heads off. And that is just a sign of how much we own this rock. No other species is going to threaten our offspring. We will kick its butt. And thus our offspring get to be the most annoying offspring on the planet. They are that safe. Yep. And because crying is an inbuilt reflex, it doesn't start at birth. Kids are crying in the womb. We just don't hear it because their lungs are filled up with amniotic fluid. Right. And there was a case a number of years ago where a doctor was performing some kind of procedure and he injected a bubble of air into the womb. And then that night he gets a call from the mother saying, the bubble of air is letting me and my husband hear the baby crying and it's keeping us awake. What do we do? And the doctor said, well, try rolling over on your side so that the bubble gets away from its face.
That would be disconcerting to say the least.
Yeah.
So the Titans sensors are down at this point, and they've got old fashioned. They've got crewmen staring out portholes basically to look for the enemy ship, which takes back hundreds of years.
I like that. That's really nice that they did that. It's a little unbelievable because they should have cameras for that. They should have cameras, looking out portholes, and you just pipe that footage to a station on the bridge and have, and even have machine learning looking at it for patterns in the nebula that could be the Shrike. So they didn't really need to have crewmen standing there looking with Mark I eyeballs, but I like the principle that, okay, our sensors are offline for the bazillionth time. Now let's try looking out the window.
Right. Windows are important. And one of the crewmen is the same guy who, in the first episode, gave Picard the side eye when he came aboard. I don't know if you guys remember that. So as they were piped aboard, and Seven was taken, there was the camera focused on one guy who kind of gave a side glance at Picard. It was the same guy who turns out to be a changeling. And interesting that it's the changelings who are apparently the big bad here, or at least a faction of changelings. Apparently it's not going to be the conspiracy bugs like we were talking about last time.
Yeah.
So what do you think of changelings as returning as perhaps the big bad?
I thought it was fine. They have some history. They were an effective villain in Deep Space Nine, and a faction of them could be an effective villain here. I'm glad they didn't say the whole collective has gone bad, because that would mean Odo failed, and maybe even Odo had been corrupted, and I wouldn't want to see that. It would deprive Deep Space Nine of its positive ending if that had happened. So I don't mind it being changelings, and I'm glad it's only a faction.
Well, and they point out, Raffi and Worf, when they're talking, or point out that if they need to figure out how to stop this without igniting the Dominion War again,
right?
Because that's the hope of this faction, is to get the Dominion War ramped up again,
right? For a moment, I had a memory lapse as I was watching, and I'm like, oh, maybe we'll see Odo. Oh, right. And for those who don't remember, the actor Rene Auberjonois died a few years ago, so we won't be.
I thought about that, though, because he's a changeling. He's actually probably be the easiest person to recast. You could find someone who looks vaguely like him with a little bit of makeup. It wouldn't be that hard to.
Or have him show up as somebody else, just as a different face. But I suppose, although I think to honor Rene, I kind of hope they don't do that, but we'll see.
And besides, they already brought him back in Prodigy by voice anyways, so.
Yes, they did.
They could also do something creative, like I'm sort of the son of Odo because of weird changeling biology. I'm kind of like him, but not exactly.
That's an interesting idea. It's interesting. So, meanwhile, on the Titan, LaForge, I forget her first name, Geordi's daughter, Sydney, thank you, goes to visit Seven in her quarters, where Seven is listening to Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus, which is kind of an interesting choice.
It's like, the Hail True Body of Christ. Wow. Okay.
That was nice to see.
I was surprised when it said Ave Verum Corpus in the subtitles I was watching. It's like, really?
There's a lot of classical music in this series so far, which I thought was this season, and there's more later on in the episode. So, LaForge.
By the way, something I hadn't realized is the actress who plays Sidney LaForge is LeVar Burton's actual daughter.
Is she really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, wow.
She decided to become an actress, and they chose to incorporate this family relationship in the series, and which is very moving for LeVar Burton.
Right. That's awesome. Her last name is not Burton, so presumably her mom's name or a stage name. Wow, that's cool. So she goes to Seven. It's kind of weird, the ensign going to cheer up the commander, which I think is a bit of an odd choice, the XO. But she goes and she says, my dad had a hard time making friends. And I'm thinking, did Geordi have a hard time making friends? Was that a thing in TNG? Because I never got that sense.
No, not friends. He had difficulties with ladies. And that's one thing that also, I saw an interview with LeVar Burton where he was talking about one of the things he was not on board with was the idea that Geordi was shy around women. And he wanted to see that rectified in this series. So we're joining him as a full-fledged, settled-in, married man, family man, indicating whatever issues he might have had with feeling uncomfortable around women at the time, he got over them. That's not who he is.
Right. The stereotype of the nerdy, shy engineer. Yeah,
he was definitely not a Barkley. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Right. So So she's cheering up at the, 7. She calls her Commander 7, by the way. I don't know if you
I like that. Oh, totally. It's because, and they had made a point of Shaw not wanting her to use her Borg designation. And so the crew is officially supposed to refer to her as Commander Hansen. And for Sydney to say Commander 7, that's a nice personal touch.
And Sydney says, my dad is the famous Commander, Geordie LaForge. And of course I entered Starfleet, but I didn't become an engineer like everyone expected. I became a pilot. And, when I don't follow expectations, it's kind of like our similar situation. So kind of interesting. So then we get to the scene of Picard confronting Beverly. And I know I speculated last time. She didn't actually say Jack was Picard's son, but now we get it. It's finally clear, it's that Jack is Picard's son. And he confronts her, like, why didn't you tell me? And she tells him, this is when I got pregnant, when I was still on the Enterprise, my last couple months there. And I decided not to tell you. You're always in danger, basically. Every time I thought it was time to tell you, some other dangerous situation come up. And she made his choice for him. And that's one of the things he says. You don't get to condemn people before the fact.
Yeah, because she thought if she told him, he wouldn't change and it would endanger them and their baby. And so she wanted to protect the baby. And she did say she tried to tell him several times, and she names like 3 incidents in rapid succession where she was going to tell him, and then there was another assassination attempt on you. And I thought this was a very interesting conversation from a writing perspective, because, there's a high level decision that was made early on of Beverly had this secret child, and it's Picard's son, and she didn't tell him, and she cut off contact with everybody. And then you've got the writing challenge of, now how do you justify that? And because you're going to have to address the issue. So what reasons do you make up that would be sensible for Beverly to have made that series of decisions? And I think they don't fully succeed. I think Picard is right to say, you should have told me anyway. You cut me out of the biggest decision of my life, is one of his lines. And history might have been completely different. He may have backed off on all the galactic adventuring if he knew that he had a child, and you denied me the ability to make that decision. And I agree. I think if you've been fooling around with someone and you get pregnant, you need to tell them about it. Right. Whether you want to be with them is a separate question, but they need to know they're a father. And so as I was watching the beginning of the conversation, I was thinking to myself, Beverly is mistaken here. Whatever she says, she's ultimately mistaken. And so this will be interesting to see how they play out this scene with Beverly having done something wrong. And how do they approach that? And can she come up with reasons that, even though they're not sufficient, take the edge off of it to the point that it's dramatically acceptable, given that she's a good person and has been established as a good person as a character? And, I don't actually know that they fully achieved that, because I think of Beverly as such a good person that she would have just told him. She really, based on the character as she was at the end of Next Generation and in the movies, she would have told him, but she didn't. And so I don't know that it's entirely successful, but it is such a great scene dramatically, watching them fight and verbally, and they both make good points, and she's really zings him a few times. And he, like, at one point she says, you told me you were afraid of that you didn't want children, you were afraid of becoming your father. And we now have more background on his family of origin situation from last season. But he then rightly
angry,
throws that back in her face and basically says, "How dare you use that as a weapon against me when I shared that with you in confidence." And it's a really great scene with a lot of really nice acting.
She keeps pivoting in the she keeps pivoting in the conversation to another new argument, which I think was an interesting, like, she's been practicing this argument for the last 20 years.
Probably so.
And this is where I kind of disagree a little bit, that I think this actually was very well written. She made a bad choice 20 years ago by not being, even with everything that's going on, they still have voicemail in the 24th, 25th century.
Yeah.
And she never left a voicemail message. She never sent him a text. She didn't even send him an old snail mail letter, which he would appreciate because he's Picard. He likes old things like books. Didn't do any of that. And then she just sat there and justified it. And that whole conversation was her trying to justify it. And she rightfully looked bad in this conversation.
Yeah.
And she is a good person, and she's been played as a good person. She continues to be played as a good person. But this was a bad decision she made back then, and she hasn't come to grips yet that she should have done more to change that bad decision. I think that was one of the more powerful scenes. Where it basically, because as you point out, she's getting put on her heels. Picard's like, you had no right to keep this from me. You had no right to make this choice for me. My life may have been very different the last 20 years if you had told me. And then she tries to put it back on him again, and not to be willing to say, you're right. I screwed up on this one.
Right.
Yeah. And I agree. She does look bad, not in a dramatically displeasing way.
No.
But her character takes a hit from this, and it's actually nice to see characters on Next Gen make mistakes, because next Gen usually would not let them do that. And Deep Space Nine was much more, we're going to let our characters make mistakes, like when Worf aborts a mission and a man dies because he wants to save Jadzia. Into
the Pale Moonlight, which is the classic one.
Into the Pale Moonlight. I mean, that is an amazing episode. So, having characters do unethical things and make bad decisions, that's something we don't typically get to see on Next Gen. So I liked that. I also liked that as part of it, they included the element about, I told Jack about you. When he was old enough, I told him about you and encouraged him to get in contact with you. And he didn't want that. And that doesn't undo her bad decision, but it does put a different complexion on it, which then creates additional problems for Picard going forward, because now he knows his son, even after he learned about him, and presumably learned, I didn't tell your father about you. So he knows it wasn't Picard's fault. He shouldn't be blaming Picard, and he still didn't want anything to do with him. And that creates some additional dramatic tension for Picard and Jack.
So she ends their argument. She says, she'd already lost both of her parents, her husband, and her son Wesley to the stars that owned Picard. And she says, as a mother, I knew I could protect my child. I wasn't sure if I could protect yours. That she says, Picard's child. And which is a bit ironic given the current situation they're in, which is she couldn't protect Jack and she called Picard to come protect him. And that's interesting. Although I wonder, are they after Jack because he's Picard's child or not? That's still something that needs to be determined, I think.
I think it's going to end up being that, because they've openly raised the possibility on screen. I mean, so it'd be hard to see this as like, oh no, Picard is completely irrelevant to why Jack is, under threat.
Right. It is Picard after all, this series. So then we transitioned, now that we've talked about Jack not wanting to see Picard, we transitioned to him and Riker in the hall.
But before also in that scene, they address the issue of Jack's accent. Beverly says two things. She says he went to school in London and he never shook it. And then she says, maybe it's genetic.
Yeah, maybe it's in his DNA. That was awesome. I'm glad they addressed it because we talked about it before. Right? So I'm glad they did that.
And it's believable because, or at least more believable, it depends on what age he went to school in London, because accents are formed not based on how the parents talk. Linguists have studied this, and children actually pick up their accents from their age mates. So from other children. So if you think you're going to give your accent to your child by talking to your child, no. Your child's going to develop his or her accent by listening to other children.
Although homeschool kids, especially in the pandemic era, that's going to be interesting. My kids talk like they're from New York, so I don't know. Like Boston, my wife's from Texas. I'm from Boston. Maybe it's somewhere in between, but so yeah, Beverly actually says at one point, I don't know why they're after Jack, but she thinks it's Picard they're really after, or whoever is behind Vatic, which is presumably the changelings. So that's kind of interesting. So we have this scene with Riker and Jack in the hall, and Jack's pacing back and forth furiously, and Riker is doing his patented Riker smirk. He's kind of laughing at Jack's attitude. And he tells him, the crew, as they go by, are giving Jack this nasty look, and Riker tells Jack they don't trust you because they don't know why they should put their lives on the line for you. You're not telling us everything, and they don't trust you. Their lives are in danger, and you're not saying why, and which is interesting. And so that's mainly most of what happens in that scene. I'm not sure there's much else. There's a bit of talk about. Jack says that he heard that Picard was positronic now, so we have a reference to Picard's synthness.
And Riker says he's the same man. Also, he tells Jack that Jack responds to the bit about these people are putting their lives on the line for you, and they're not sure you're worth saving. At the cost of their lives. And Jack is like, well, I didn't ask them to. And Riker's like, it doesn't matter that you didn't ask them to.
Right.
You're in this situation now. You may as well make them feel better about it if they're risking their lives for you. And after that, Jack does kind of turn. I mean, he did not have a previous relationship with Seven, but he starts teaming up with Seven. And he also helps out in the medical bay and things like that. And so I think that was kind of a conversation that caused Jack to take a different approach.
Right. And then when Picard comes out and he and Riker get in the turbolift to go to the bridge, Picard basically tells Riker that the relationship is irreparable, that there's no way to fix what happened, which is obviously
not going to be true.
Not going to be true. Right. So back to the bridge. You mentioned that Shaw gets injured in one of the encounters with the Shrike. And he interestingly turns command over to Riker, which I think is an interesting move that he does, for him to do. He doesn't call Seven to the bridge and put her back in, put her in command as the first officer, because she's been basically arrested. Riker's now in charge, and it's an interesting. I mean, Shaw doesn't have a whole lot of choice here, but it's still an interesting admission. Like, I think, in fact, he says this situation demands a man like you, not a man like me, basically.
Well, he doesn't say it like that. He says, you got us into this, you're going to get us out. And then he transfers the command codes to him. And in context, he's just been injured. He needs to go to sickbay for treatment. And obviously you can't command in a battle from sickbay when you're injured and being treated. So I would have set it up. I would have had him be injured a little more severely to make it more obvious to the viewer that he has to go get treated. Because it wasn't, I mean, he's been knocked up, he's bleeding a little, he's been knocked around, he's been bleeding a little. That doesn't on Star Trek mean you've got to go be treated immediately. I would have had him be more severely injured to make that clearer. And he made the right choice rather than let's have Admiral Ancient be in command.
Right.
Riker is still of an age and disposition that he could make an effective combat commander. And so you're it.
And he's still in Starfleet, whereas Picard is not. Yeah. And then they have this encounter with the Shrike where they use a torpedo in an interesting way to concuss it away. And Picard turns to Riker and says, "It might be time for you to start calling me number one," which is a nice, funny little
that was
throwback.
a nice human moment.
Yeah. So back to the Raffi Worf show, and we have back on La Serena, we have Worf working out to Berlioz's opera, which we know how Klingons love their opera, so it's kind of fun.
That was fun. Also, Worf has the best line.
Yes.
Was as Raffi is, she's woken up, she's adjusting to her new situation. She sees Worf doing his calisthenics, and he's swinging the sword around and everything. And she doesn't know who he is because she only got brief, drugged out glimpses of him when he showed up in the previous episode. And so she wants to know who he is. And in his Michael Dorn projecting voice, he says effectively, I may not get every element of this, but he says, "I am Worf, son of Moog, house of Martok, son of Sergei, house of Alexander," or not, house of Rozhenko, Nemesis, Bane of the Duras, slayer of Gowron. I have made chamomile tea. Do you take sugar?
Which is great. I saw someone do a little meme with a Starbucks cup with all of that written on it, like all of his stuff, his name, and then someone asked on Twitter, "Is it chamomile tea inside?" And Terry Matalas, the showrunner, replied, "Of course." Chamomile tea. I love that. Not prune juice, which is a warrior's drink. And so Worf reveals, more about being the handler. He's, like you mentioned in your recap, he's not in Starfleet, but our interests align, which is an interesting thing. I mean, he's retired Starfleet, so he's connected. He
could always reactivate him, but he's not currently serving.
Right. And he says he discovered the guy who's really behind Sneed, not the Romulan fall guy whose head has been taken off, but this other guy. And he and Raffi are going to track him down because something bigger is coming. And we have this, I thought it was a kind of a good line, like when using a portal gun, stealing this portal gun apocalyptic device and using it to destroy an entire building in one shot is the distraction. Then that means whatever else is coming is going to be really bad. And so I thought that was a nice little moment there.
Also, like at the end of that scene, as they're about to go look for this human terrorist, Worf, is talking to Raffi, and he also, by the way, calls her by her full name, Rafaela.
Yes.
And he's the only person who does that. But he turns to her, and he's talking to her. He says, "You have served me well." And she says, she has a great line, and she says, "Whoa, where is all this past tense coming from?"
Yeah.
And then he invites her along on the mission.
Is it me or is Michael Dorn less boomy with his voice? I mean, you still get that stentorian, voice, the really great Worf voice, but it's less like snarling, I think. Do you think he's intentionally kind of the older, calmer Worf?
It could be. He also, and I saw an interview with him where he was discussing this, because like one of the things that they had was, how is he going to appear? Were they going to redesign him like they redesigned other Klingons? Unfortunately, they did not make the boneheadedly stupid move of doing that. Worf needs to look like Worf. No? Take it as you will. But they did have a question of like, how aged should he be? And they had shown him, we don't know really. I mean, it's at least somewhat undefined about how do Klingons age. I remember one source years ago that suggested Klingons actually age very rapidly because they have these rough, tough lives, and they burn through them quickly, and they don't live to be 200, and they age pretty quickly. But then Deep Space Nine contradicted that by bringing back all of the Klingons from the original series, and they're still alive, and they've just got gray hair now. And in the end of Next Gen, they showed a 20 years older Worf with gray hair. So they they approached Michael Dorn about that, and he initially wasn't apparently too keen on going gray, but it was in their discussion, the idea of a particular character came up from Kill Bill. It's a martial arts master. I have never seen the Kill Bill movies, but there's a martial arts master who's Asian in them, and he has white hair. And he's got, actually, you look at his hair, he's got a kind of a mustache goatee thing that's kind of similar to Worf, and in the new series, and his this Asian martial arts master's hair is pure white, and he's like, he can kill anybody. And so even though he's old, he has not lost his deadliness. He can kill anybody. And they decided to model Worf on that. So they made him go totally white. And it's partly inspired by this Asian martial arts master from Kill Bill.
Interesting.
See, I figured with the voice, which was kind of the original question you brought up there, Dom, I wonder how much of it just has to do with we're dealing with 40 years newer recording technology. The sound is better. The editing software is, I mean, in fact, it's editing software, not editing hardware now, and stuff like that. I just wonder if it's not so much age as it is just better technology.
I think that could be part of one of the factors. Also, Michael Dorn's voice box has aged, by 30 years, and so he's got a 30-year-old older voice. And I think he is, I know when we get to feedback, we're going to talk about this. Is he a pacifist thing or not? And he's not. But he is older and wiser and more mature and more calculated. And I think he may be trying to project that sensibility with his voice, where he's not the angry, snarling young Klingon he used to be.
So we go back to Titan after this, and we find out that the nebula is not a nebula per se. It is something else. It has electronic and biological signatures throughout it.
Electrical.
Electrical signals. And is it because there's changeling planet inside? Are they sensing the change? At first, I thought that's what they were talking about, but maybe there's something else going on.
Yeah, I think it's the nebula's alive. And that's why Jack had the vision. In the vision, Seven appears to him and bends over him, and there are branches of some kind. They look kind of like blood vessels growing behind her on the ceiling. And the vision says to Jack, connect the branches, and I think it says, find me. And then he has a vision of a door opening. Right. And so I think that the nebula is alive, or certainly there's something living down in the gravity well.
I just had a thought. What if it's Wesley? Because Wesley showed up in the last season. It's his brother.
It's possible, but I would doubt that.
Yeah.
Also, if that were the case, why would it appear as a female?
Right. That's true. Well, in any case, I wonder if it's also just how they get out of the nebula and away from the Shrike. That will be the solution, but we'll see that. That's speculation. So the Vatic and the Shrike starts using the portal weapon to corral the Titan, trying to run, because Riker's all about we need to run, even though Picard keeps saying we have to turn and fight.
Yeah, and Riker is justified in that the Shrike vastly outclasses them in terms of firepower.
Why is Picard so like we need to stand and fight them versus run, even though they're outclassed?
He thinks that Riker is playing it overly safe because of loss aversion. He wants to save all these people on the ship and get them to the nearest starbase. And he apparently thinks that the best defense is good offense. Well, okay, maybe, but Riker is correct by the numbers, and Picard is off base. And I don't think they convincingly reveal to us why Picard is taking the approach he is. This is, I think, a writing choice to kill runtime. in the episode by pitting two of our heroes against each other with opposing viewpoints. And they need to both have justification for their viewpoints, and they don't. Riker is clearly correct. And now, eventually, the writers force Riker into a position where he has no ability to run, at which point he has no option but to try Picard's plan. But I think it's a little bit of a weakness in the writing that they don't give us a good reason for Picard's taking the position he is taking. Also, and we alluded to this earlier, this is a weaker part of the episode, but Picard progressively becomes more and more aggressive, and ultimately he becomes insubordinate. He is fairly late in the episode. He and Riker are on the bridge, and Picard is insisting that they attack the Shrike, and he is doing so in front of the crew. And he is thus undermining Riker's authority by critiquing the captain's plans in front of the crew. And that is insubordination. And I'm like, dude, you are insubordinate now.
Right. And he's the legendary Picard and the captain whose substitute, whose authority is still... Yeah.
And he's the acting first officer.
Right.
So this is a first officer against the captain conflict in front of the crew that you do not let happen. So I think now you can say, okay, bad writing, but you can also say sign of Picard aging. He is not what he used to be.
Right. And we saw that a little bit in the last season, just like Picard's, sometimes being a little bit irrational or more angry than we remember him being at times and that sort of thing. So I think they're still playing with that. So we go back to Raffi and Worf. They've now captured this human that was behind Sneed, this human terrorist, and they're interrogating him aboard La Serena. And Raffi assumes that his demeanor is because he's suffering withdrawals, and they're doing good cop, bad cop. Worf is good cop.
I know. I love this. Raffi is bad. I love the good cop, bad cop routine with Raffi is bad cop and Worf is good cop. That is awesome.
Right. Worf is calm, and he's trying to appeal to him. At one point, he says, "There is no good, no bad. There's no such thing as good or bad. Anger isn't the way." Do you think he's really saying this? Is this just a gambit?
I think it's a gambit. Worf clearly believes in good and evil, but he's trying to get this terrorist to reveal information. And terrorists frequently have a nihilistic worldview, or at least he imagines they do. And so he says, there is no good, there is no evil. You believe in your fight.
Right. And that's about, when we start to, Worf figures it out before Raffi does, is that this isn't just an addict going through withdrawals. It's a changeling who's about to, who hasn't had enough time to regenerate, what I guess is
they have to basically sleep in liquid form. And this guy is near the end of his wakeful activity period and is about to forcibly revert to goo in their presence. And he's trying to get through this situation before that happens and not succeeding.
And he does reveal that the portal, like I mentioned before, the portal weapon was misdirection for something more dangerous that they stole from Daystrom that no one noticed. Do you think that's lore?
Yeah.
Or before? Yeah.
I think it's a Sung android that, yeah.
Okay. That will be where that plays in. So my note here is he's a founder. The Dominion is back! Exclamation point. Which is was fun. I wonder if we'll get Jeffrey Combs as Wei Yun again. No, maybe not.
That would be awesome.
That would be awesome.
If we had
I don't think we're getting anything of the actual Dominion. We're just going to have this breakaway branch that's probably not going to have the.
Yeah,
Florida.
I know. I was kind of hopeful. So Worf acknowledges there's a terrorist faction of the Changelings who've broken off, kind of inferring that Odo has let him know, and that Odo was a man of honor who would never let the Changelings become this and that sort of thing. So the Changeling, here with that reveal, we get the reveal of the Changeling aboard the Titan, who sabotages the warp drive so they can't escape. And, it blows up a plasma conduit. And then
also, just to tie up what happens with Worf and Raffi, the changeling does revert to goo in front of them.
Right.
And it starts to try to escape in its goo form. And at least apparently Worf vaporizes it. But we don't see it clearly enough that they could bring the changeling back next time. But it looked like Worf vaporized it.
Right. And so meanwhile, the Shrike is running down the now warpless Titan, which can't escape. So Picard, Riker realizes, I do have to take Picard's advice. Now we really do have to turn and fight. And they start shooting torpedoes, and they use the portal device to redirect the torpedoes. He says,
fire everything we've got, and which is a nice dramatic line. And then we see them fire 4 photon torpedoes. So apparently everything we've got was 4 photon torpedoes.
Well, thankfully they don't appear to be all that dangerous torpedoes, because they kind of explode harmlessly on the Titan's own shields when the portal redirects it. And they do fall into the gravity well that they've been trying to stay out of, and they fall into this dark area of the nebula. And to avoid the gravity well, the Shrike retreats at this point. Yeah. And inside this gravity well, this looks like asteroids or some other, rocks floating around. And this is where Riker turns to Picard and tells, remove yourself from the bridge. You've just killed us all. And it was like, I thought that was an odd, what else? Like, why is this Picard's fault? You're the captain and you had no other choice but to fire at them. Like, I took it as two things: writers wanting to end with a nice dramatic line and moment, and if I need a diegetic reason for it, I can say Worf has just been butting heads with Admiral Ancient and his insubordination, and even though it's not actually Picard's fault what just happened, he's just frustrated at this point, and Picard in particular is a source of frustration because he's been needling him all this time. Okay, finally tried your plan. It failed. We're dead. I don't want to see you anymore. Get out of here. Right. And like you said, that's where the episode ends. So final thoughts on this episode, Father Cory? Anything?
Nothing here.
Jimmy? No, I thought it was a good episode. I enjoyed it. Yeah. Yep. Excellent. So I mentioned we got lots of feedback, so I want to share some of that now from our last episode, the Disengage, it was called. First, it comes from YouTube, where Rube's Good Brain Coffee writes, this episode reminded me of the time when Spock changed course for Vulcan without Kirk's permission. If I remember correctly, Kirk had also been asleep. And that was... which one was that? Amok Time. Oh, right. So yes. The name of that correspondent was what again? Rube's Good Brain Coffee. It sounds like a zombie beverage. Well, coffee is good for your brain. Great name, though. The name. Rob Cox on Facebook writes, yes, it is very much akin to Wrath of Khan, but I don't think to its detriment. After the second episode, I'm liking Captain Shaw. I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys thought. I continue to like Captain Shaw. Also, and I forgot to mention this, there's another Wrath of Khan-like moment in this episode, because after they realize that they have a gas leak that is allowing the Shrike to track them, they get the idea of let's discontinue the gas leak, and then when the trail runs out, they will stop and we will sneak up behind them. Right. Which is the three-dimensional thinking that Kirk did in Wrath of Khan. And they do it. Unfortunately, unlike Khan, the Shrike actually has a portal gun that can throw your own photon torpedoes back at you. Yep. Then Julio Salazar via email writes, just a few lines to tell you how much I enjoy listening to your podcast, which is one of the best on the Star Trek fandom. I'm a big fan since TNG, and I follow the Trek universe even through the novels. That's why I found Riker's rank as captain surprising, as he had been promoted to admiral in the Fall series. It's a shame that apparently those stories are no longer part of the canon. Anyway, let me congratulate all of you for the program. It's well organized, insightful, and entertaining all along. And just to comment on the disengaged feedback part, I also think that providing some balance is important and necessary. It gives a wider variety to the universe and to your show. Big hugs from Peru.
Gracias, Julio. I on the subject of canon in Star Trek, my understanding is unfortunately it's not like Star Wars or Babylon 5 or Doctor Who, where the tie-in media are generally assumed to be canonical by the creators. However, my approach would be, this is just an alternate timeline. And so if you like a series of novels where Riker's an admiral, that's just an alternate timeline.
Like the Kelvin timeline. Yeah, a lot. I've read a lot of Star Trek novels, and a lot of stuff that they wrote to take place after the series had all ended has all been thrown out. You know, everything having to do with DS9, everything having to do with Picard and Crusher getting married and having a kid in the books. So yeah, unfortunately, none of that has ever been recognized as canon for whatever has been filmed. Kara from Discord writes, I wanted to add to the discussion of Jimmy sometimes taking a more critical approach on the episodes by commending all of you on being, as Dom said, picky fans. I listen to your podcast rather than others because you're doing more than just summarizing and enthusing. You ask good questions and challenge the writers in ways that I would not think to. I think this show, like many on the network, helped make consuming media more than just a passive experience. If a producer or writer for the shows ever finds secrets of Star Trek, I think they would be challenged to do better in how they create the universe. All that to say, you're doing a great job, and I'm enjoying watching through Picard with you. Thank you,
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. I don't indulge in a huge amount of watching other, Star Trek fan reactions. I do a little bit. I see sometimes like videos by Trek Culture on YouTube, and there is this phenomenon of recap and gush, and among some outlets, and I don't find it very satisfying, which is why I don't watch it, because I'm not interested in just watching someone gush. I want to understand, and I want to think about writing choices and so forth. At least Trek Culture, when they do stuff, they tend to be pretty gushy, but they also do have something they call ups and downs for as an episode review format, where they give an up, meaning they liked something, to one aspect of an episode, and give a down, meaning they didn't like it, to another aspect of the same episode that they're reviewing. And so they are trying to be at least somewhat critical. But what I find unsatisfying about that is it's just personal impressions. They never discuss, they never think in terms of the writing mechanics, or at least I don't think they sufficiently think in terms of writing mechanics and explore alternatives. And it's just kind of quick hits, liked this, didn't like that, without much discussion. And I much prefer thinking from a writing perspective of, why are they doing this? How else could they have handled this? What are the costs and benefits of doing it this way?
Yeah. By the way, if a writer or producer for Star Trek ever would like to join us for a discussion, we'd love to have them.
Or if a producer would like to hire, a writer who thinks about these things, I am available.
I was going to mention that the Secrets of Stargate, one of our other shows, recently had Joseph Malazzi, one of the executive producers for Stargate SG-1 and Stargate Atlantis.
We just recorded an interview with him that will come out as our 100th episode.
Nice. Yeah, in a few weeks. So we're open to that. Our next feedback comes from Brian on Patreon, who writes, I was a little disappointed by Worf. There was a trailer that had him telling Riker he was a pacifist, after which Riker says, we're all going to die. That when we see him in this episode, he kills 4 people. I'm confused as to where this is going.
So I can shed some light on this, because I did watch an interview. It had Jonathan Frakes and Michael Dorn and LeVar Burton and the Terry Matalas in it, and they addressed this question. The interviewer was talking to them, and they pointed out this "Is Worf a pacifist?" scene that had been in the trailer, and had been somewhat divisive in fandom, and what they said, and so I think this is an illustration of, and I'd even seen a remark from someone connected with the program saying the trailer is taking footage out of context. So the things that you're seeing in the trailer don't necessarily mean what you would think taking them in isolation. And this appears to be an example of that. So it's where the trailer, which is designed to tease you and get you interested in watching, is misleading, and they basically said it's a joke. Worf, even though he has matured and may not be as inclined to violence as his first recourse as he previously was, he's not a pacifist. And so this is basically a joke. And Michael Dorn was like, yeah, did you notice the big, huge sword on his back? He's clearly not a pacifist.
You should have marked that feedback as spoilers, Dom. That's spoilers for later in the series. So
right. I was thinking, going to speculate that maybe Klingon pacifist is different from what humans might think of as pacifist. Klingon pacifist may not be against all violence, but that brings up a whole nother issue of trailers and marketing departments making deceptive trailers, and that's really annoying.
Well, we've already seen an example of that, where in the trailer we had this shot of Beverly saying it will be what it's always been, attempts on your life, and they made it sound like that's our adventure, right? And in context, it's her justifying why she never told him about Jack, because it is what it always was, attempts on your life. That's why I didn't tell you about Jack.
Right. Brett sends an email. I just wanted to drop a quick line about the realistic nature of the head in Disengaged, the severed Romulan head.
The disengaged head.
The disengaged head. While I agree that the head does not look realistic at all, a lot of shows have had to deal with this issue. There was actually a time when television shows tried to go for more realistic, more blood, for example. What they found, however, was that people had become so used to how blood and gore looked on TV that it made the realistic stuff look fake. I've actually spoken with jurors after trial, Brett's apparently an attorney, who questioned whether something they saw, not to be too graphic, but I believe it was an arm, was real or not because it looked fake. Just a fun little thing I wanted to tell you guys. Like y'all said, though, that head looked fake. Enjoying this season so far.
Yeah, it's interesting how things have changed over time. It would be interesting to see, like, okay, so how realistic were they getting before they decided to pull back on it? And I can easily imagine that happening because there was, in the late 60s and 70s, there was a period where the rating system, for example, for movies was new, and you could do very daring things without triggering higher ratings. Like if you watch the original Planet of the Apes movie from 1968, which has lobotomized brain surgeryed humans, and we're treating you and Nova as a breeding pair, and all of mankind is dead, and all of this, it's a really intense movie. You have apes running around chasing people, and violence and sexuality and all kinds of stuff. That movie has a G rating.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. By the standards of the time, it got a G rating. And so I can easily imagine, and we're much tighter about ratings now than we were then. So I can imagine, people in that kind of revolutionary, hey, things are changing, let's be hip and edgy, going for more gruesome realism, including on TV, that they then pulled back from. It would be interesting to see what that is. Also, a lot of stuff, and I wonder at times to what extent were realism, like when you see blood, you watch some films like 1940s cowboy movies, and people just clutch their chest and fall over and there's no blood. There's not even a hole on the back of their shirt. And so it's completely unrealistic. But then I watch other things from like the 60s or 70s, and they're dripping blood, and I'm like, dude, that is just red paint. Yeah. It's not even food coloring in syrup. It's just red paint. I could put that on the side of a barn. And so you see significantly varying qualities of realism. And I always wonder about why exactly was this chosen.
Yeah. So our last feedback comes from Eric, who wrote to us last time, and he has 2 comments. So I'll read the first one. He said, this was just a reference to the episode. Just noticed a callback from season 2. Apparently someone on the writing staff is obsessed with the number 17. In season 2, Q makes a reference to Dr. Sung sitting down in 17 seconds, then proceeds to talk about family. In season 3, the episode title of episode 3 is 17 seconds, again relating to family. I wonder if there's a correlation somehow.
Yeah, I don't really remember that. I'd have to go back and review it and to see exactly what happened.
I think sometimes writers, they give it when they need a random number, they sometimes fixate on a particular random number, so it could be that too.
It could be also 17 is a prime number. And so that could make it extra attractive.
Yes.
So then is that proof then that this is Prime Universe? Oh,
it's the Prime timeline. So and then Eric sent another feedback, and he says, first, let me say I was not expecting to hear my comment read last week, and I sincerely appreciate Jimmy's thoughtful response. Jimmy said something in his reply. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it made me reconsider my point of view. One thing Jimmy did not mention was that how a listener's perception can be altered by their own current circumstances. I think that I may have been having a bad day when I wrote that, and I myself might have been the Debbie Downer. I always go back and listen to the previous podcast before the new one comes out. I listened to the Picard Season 3 episode 1 podcast again this morning, and I did not notice the negativity nearly as much as I did when I made my original comment, which made me realize that my situation may affect my perception of what I'm hearing. Hearing my comment read back to me made me realize that it was excessively harsh and unfair to Jimmy, and so I owe him an apology. I appreciated hearing his point of view and want to offer an apology for my harshness in my previous comments. I believe they were unwarranted. I still love SQPN. So.
Well, thank you, Eric. Glad you still like SQPN, and thank you very much. No hard feelings at all. Don't worry about it. And I certainly agree that our moods and what we're going through affects how we perceive things. That happens to everybody. Also, it's another universal experience to, write something or say something and go back later and revisit it and think, that came off different than how I meant. So no problem at all. And thank you very much.
Yep. We love getting feedback. So, and that's all our feedback this time. And thank you everyone for all that wonderful feedback. Before we go, we'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons who make it possible for us to create the Secrets of Star Trek, including Kelsey S., Jim B., Andy F., Andrew P., and David H. Their generous tax-deductible donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue the Secrets of Star Trek and all the shows at StarQuest, and you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. So that's it from us for this time. What did you think of 17 Seconds, this Picard episode? You can let us know by commenting on the show at sqpn.com/trek, or our Facebook page at facebook.com/StarQuestMedia, or send an email to trek@sqpn.com, or visit our StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or watch the show, Secrets of Star Trek, on our YouTube channel, where you can also leave a comment in the YouTube channel as at youtube.com/StarQuestMedia. We'll be back next time when we'll be discussing the next new episode of Picard called No-Win Scenario. I wonder what else you could call the no-win scenario. Anyway, until then, Father Cory Sticha, thank you for joining me and sharing the Secrets of Star Trek.
Thank you, Dom.
Jimmy Akin, thank you as well.
Thank you. I am Jimmy, son of Jimmy, house of Akin, bane of heretics, and slayer of false hypotheses. I have made some chamomile tea. Do you take sugar?
2 lumps. And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to the Secrets of Star Trek on StarQuest, and remember, beheadings are on Wednesdays.